A 2,000-year-old scroll pulled from a cave above the Dead Sea, may be describing machines that haven't been built yet. That's not a metaphor. That's what a small group of researchers, armed with imaging tools and pattern recognition algorithms more powerful than anything previous generations of scholars had access to, are quietly arguing in 2026. And the argument is louder than you'd expect. To understand why this story has legs, you have to go back to a winter morning in 1946. A Bedouin shepherd named Mohammed Devdib was looking for a lost goat along the limestone cliffs near a wadi called Qumran, on the northwestern shore of the Dead Sea. He threw a stone into a cave. He heard pottery crack. Inside those jars were the first of what would eventually be roughly 900 manuscripts scattered across 11 caves, discovered in stages between 1946 and 1956. Hebrew, Aramaic, Greek, some written on parchment, some on papyrus. One, famously, hammered onto thin sheets of copper. For 70 years, the scrolls sat at the intersection of religious history and academic archaeology. The Great Isaiah Scroll, catalogued as one Kizel, became the star exhibit at the Shrine of the Book in Jerusalem. The War Scroll, the Temple Scroll, the Community Rule, most of it slotted neatly into what scholars expected. Sectarian texts, biblical commentary, apocalyptic literature, dreaming of cosmic battles between sons of light and sons of darkness. The Israel Antiquities Authority, working with the École Biblique in Jerusalem, spent decades stabilizing, cataloging, and slowly publishing the fragments. By the early 2000s, most experts believed the textual mining was largely done. What remained was interpretation. Then, the imaging changed everything. Around 2011, a project called the Leon Levy Dead Sea Scrolls Digital Library, run in partnership with the Israel Antiquities Authority and Google, began photographing every fragment using multispectral imaging. We're talking about cameras that capture wavelengths the human eye can't see, infrared, near ultraviolet, specific bands tuned to bring up ink that's faded into the parchment over 20 centuries. Suddenly, scholars could read letters that had been invisible for hundreds of years. Suddenly, fragments that looked blank weren't blank. And that's the doorway this whole story walked through. Enter Dr. Mladen Popovic, head of the Qumran Institute at the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. In 2021, Popovic and his collaborators published a paper that quietly rearranged the field. Using artificial intelligence trained on handwriting micropatterns, they showed that the Great Isaiah Scroll, long thought to be the work of a single scribe, was almost certainly written by two scribes whose hands were so similar they may have trained together. It was a small finding with enormous implications. Because if AI could distinguish between two scribes whose styles were nearly identical, why else could it pull out of the noise? That's where our story really begins. In the years since the Popovic paper, several independent teams, some affiliated with European universities, some operating as private research consortia, have been running newer machine learning models against the high-resolution imaging archive. Reconstruction algorithms that can take a damaged fragment, look at the surrounding letters, and propose statistically likely completions. Language models fine-tuned on Second Temple Hebrew and Aramaic. And according to a handful of recent conference talks and preprints, a small subset of these tools are now being run on hardware that uses what some researchers are loosely calling quantum-assisted processing. Hybrid systems where certain optimization tasks get offloaded to early quantum hardware while the bulk of the work stays classical. Whether that label is technically accurate or marketing flourish, I'll leave for the engineers to argue. What matters for our story is the output, and the output is strange. One team, working primarily with Aramaic apocalyptic fragments adjacent to the Book of Enoch tradition, claims their reconstruction model is consistently filling in damaged passages with vocabulary clusters that don't fit the standard sectarian template. Words for light that pair with words for vessel. Descriptions of the Watchers, those mysterious angelic figures from the Enochian tradition, that include phrases the model reads as ascending without wings on, chariots of refined metal. Now, before anyone gets ahead of themselves, that phrase is a translation choice. It could just as easily be rendered as climbed without feathers in carts of purified bronze. The Aramaic is doing what ancient apocalyptic Aramaic always does. It's piling up imagery. It's painting visions. But here's the part that's harder to dismiss. The Copper Scroll. Catalog number 3Q15. Found in Cave 3 in 1952. Unlike every other scroll, it isn't a religious text. It's a list. 64 locations across ancient Judea, each one allegedly hiding caches of gold, silver, and what the scroll describes using technical metallurgical vocabulary that scholars have argued about for 70 years. Weights are given in talents. Locations are described in surveyor's language. And the writing itself is hammered into copper sheets. Itself a piece of metallurgical engineering that nobody has fully explained. Why copper? Why that script style? Why that particular blend of ancient Hebrew with later Aramaic loanwords? For most of the scroll's modern history, scholars treated the Copper Scroll as either a real treasure map for temple wealth hidden before the Roman destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, or as a piece of folkloric fiction. What's changed recently is that the imaging on the Copper Scroll has gotten sharper. The engraving has been remapped in 3 dimensions, and the metallurgical vocabulary is being re-examined by people who actually understand metallurgy, not just paleography. And some of those readings are pointing toward processes, alloying, refining, working metal under specific atmospheric conditions that arguably weren't standard practice for another 1,000 years. I want to be careful here, because this is where the story bends towards something it shouldn't be. Let's bring in the skeptic, because no responsible look at this story is complete without him. Dr. Lawrence Schiffman is one of the most respected scholars of Dead Sea Scrolls and Second Temple Judaism alive. He spent decades at NU. He's published more on the legal and sectarian content of the scrolls than almost anyone. And when you ask Schiffman about technological readings of Qumran material, his response is direct. These are religious texts, he argues, written by a religious community, in a religious vocabulary, dealing with religious concerns. The Qumran sect, whoever they were, essence, a related group, something splintered off from priestly circles in Jerusalem, was preoccupied with purity, with the calendar, with the coming end of the age. Their apocalyptic imagery is borrowed from Ezekiel, from Daniel, from earlier prophetic tradition. When they describe chariots of fire, they're echoing Ezekiel's Merkava vision, which is itself a theological image, not a description of a vehicle. When they describe watchers who descended, they're working within the Enochian myth, which is a story about angelic transgression, not a memo about visitors. Reading future technology into these passages, Schiffman would tell you, is exactly the kind of mistake that has haunted Dead Sea Scrolls scholarship since the 1950s. Every generation projects its own anxieties onto the texts. The Cold War saw Qumran as a cult preparing for nuclear apocalypse. The 1970s saw it through the lens of UFO mythology. The 2010s discovered Bitcoin in everything. And now, in 2026, with AI suddenly mediating between us and the parchment, we're discovering an eye in the parchment. The phenomenon, he'd suggest, says more about us than about the scrolls. That's a serious objection, and I think it's the correct starting point for anyone evaluating these claims. But I also think Schiffman's caution doesn't quite close the door, and here's why. The machine learning reconstructions aren't projecting modern anxieties consciously. They're trained on the actual language of the surviving texts. When a model fills in a gap, it's pulling from the statistical neighborhood of words that already exist in Qumran material. So when those reconstructions repeatedly cluster around metallurgical, mechanical, and luminous vocabulary, in particular, Enochian, and War Scroll passages. That pattern is at minimum, telling us something about how often those words appear in adjacent positions in the surviving corpus. Whether that means the ancients were describing technology, or simply that their religious vocabulary was deeply material. Fire, metal, vessel, wheel, light is the real interpretive question. Take the War Scroll 1QM. It describes a final battle between the Sons of Light and the Sons of Darkness with extraordinary specificity. Troop formations, trumpet signals, banners, weaponry. There's a passage describing shields, with what's been translated as faces of polished mirror that strike with brightness. For decades, scholars read this as ceremonial imagery. Bronze shields polished for ritual display. But a researcher named Sarah Yardini, I'm using a placeholder for one of the imaging specialists working on the project, because the actual team prefers to stay out of the press until peer review concludes, has pointed out that the surrounding vocabulary suggests not just polish, but active focusing, concentration, directing brightness, which, if you wanted to read it that way, sounds an awful lot like a description of focused light weaponry. Or, a really shiny shield in the sun. Both readings sit in the text. That's the honest answer. The Temple Scroll 11Q19, the longest of the Dead Sea Scrolls, describes the construction of an idealized future temple with architectural precision so detailed that some engineers have noted it implies acoustic and ventilation considerations that weren't formally articulated in architectural treatises until centuries later. Again, interpretive. The ancients built sophisticated buildings. Of course, they understood acoustics intuitively. The question is whether the scroll is recording inherited knowledge, idealized speculation, or, as the most aggressive readings would have it, instructions from a source the community believed was beyond them. And then there's the most provocative claim circulating in 2026. A handful of passages in the Enochian fragments, reconstructed with these newer tools, appear to describe what one researcher has summarized as a process by which thought is held inside crystal and made to speak. Now, stop. That sounds exactly like the kind of breathless reading that makes serious scholars roll their eyes. And it might be. The Aramaic could mean many things. Memory stones, engraved tablets, a magical implement, a poetic image. Any of those readings is defensible from the same string of words. But the people running the AI reconstructions, when they're being careful and conservative, will tell you that the consistency of the cluster, thought, vessel, crystal, or refined stone, speech, light, appears more often than chance would predict across multiple independent fragments. And that's the actual finding, not aliens, not prophecy. A statistical pattern in vocabulary co-occurrence that doesn't fit the standard sectarian template as neatly as we used to think. So, what do we do with this? If you're a religious traditionalist, you might say the ancient authors were granted visionary glimpses of futures we're only now approaching, and the language is straining to describe what they were shown. If you're a strict materialist scholar like Schiffman, you'd say the language is doing exactly what religious language always does, reaching for the highest, brightest, most impressive imagery available to describe encounters with the divine. And our pattern recognition tools are simply surfacing the metallic, luminous metaphors that any honest reading already knew were there. If you're somewhere in the middle, you might suspect that the Qumran community inherited streams of older Near Eastern tradition, Babylonian, possibly Egyptian, possibly older, that included technical and proto-scientific elements which got folded into their apocalyptic worldview. And what the AI is doing is helping us recover the technical layer that traditional readings, focused on theology, tended to flatten. I lean toward that middle reading, but I want to be honest that I'm leaning, not concluding. Here's what the implications actually look like, set down soberly. First, the methodology matters. AI-assisted reconstruction of damaged ancient texts is going to reshape multiple fields over the next decade, not just Qumran studies. Mesopotamian cuneiform, Egyptian Demotic. Mycenaean Linear B. There are warehouses of fragmentary tablets and parchments worldwide that have been considered unreadable for a century, and a lot of them are about to start speaking. Some of what they say will be mundane. Some will be revelatory. We should expect both, and we should not let the revelatory headlines distract from the methodology that produces them. Second, when these tools surface unexpected vocabulary clusters, the responsible scholarly response is the one Mladen Popovic modeled with the two scribes paper. Publish the data. Show the math. Let the field replicate. The reason the Qumran handwriting result has held up is precisely because Popovic didn't oversell it. He showed his work. The technology in the scrolls claims being circulated in 2026 will live or die by the same standard. If the underlying statistical patterns are real, they'll hold up under peer review. If they're artifacts of overfitted models, hungry to find structure where there is none, peer review will catch that too. Third, and this is where I'd want to land, the deeper interest of this whole episode isn't whether ancient Aramaic prophets were describing quantum computers. It's almost certainly that they weren't. The deeper interest is that ancient religious vocabulary, when you look at it closely, is much more materially anchored than the spiritualized translations of the past few centuries made it appear. The Bible is full of metallurgy. Ezekiel is full of mechanical imagery. The Watchers descended onto a real mountain, in a real text, doing things described with real verbs of motion and construction. Whether or not any of that corresponds to literal events, taking the materiality of the language seriously is itself a recovery. We've been reading these texts in soft focus for a long time. The imaging and the algorithms are putting them back into hard focus. That's worth something on its own. So, here's what you can actually do with all of this. If you want to engage past the headlines, start with the primary material. The Leon Letty Dead Sea Scrolls digital library is free, online, and searchable. You can look at the Great Isaiah Scroll yourself at resolutions higher than any scholar had access to before 2011. The Shrine of the Book at the Israel Museum runs virtual tours and has English translated transcriptions of the major scrolls. Read a few passages of the War Scroll or the Copper Scroll in translation. Notice what the language is actually doing. Then read the skeptics. Schiffman's books, Reclaiming the Dead Sea Scrolls, is the most accessible, will give you the mainstream scholarly framework, and you need that framework before you can responsibly evaluate any sensational claim. After that, look up Mladen Popovic's published work on AI handwriting analysis. Read the actual paper, not just the press summaries. You'll see how careful real research in this space sounds. If you want to follow where this is heading, watch for peer-reviewed publications over the next 18 months from the Qumran Institute at Groningen, from imaging teams at the Israel Antiquities Authority, and from independent computational paleography groups. The provocative claims will either survive that gauntlet or they won't. Either outcome is informative. And keep your interpretive guardrails up. Be suspicious of anyone telling you the scrolls definitively predict modern technology. Be equally suspicious of anyone telling you there's nothing strange in the new readings worth a second look. The honest position is the uncomfortable middle. Some of what the algorithms are surfacing is probably noise. Some of it might be something we genuinely missed for 2,000 years. Sorting which is the real work, and it's just getting started. What was buried in those caves above the Dead Sea is still being read for the first time. That's the part nobody saw coming.